Chapter 46 Beyond the Veil. The brilliant light of the teleportation spell lasted only for a moment, and when Twilight's vision was no longer obscured, she was greeted to a very different environment than the Golden Oaks Library. She was hit by a sudden sense of vertigo, telling her that she had been put somewhere higher than the library's third floor. A tower was the only explanation, given the old stone brickwork surrounding them. Twilight could only assume they were in one of the few standing structures of Warden's Keep. It was the only place that would have architecture like this close enough to teleport to. Speaking of the building's construction, the only way out of this room was a door that had long since fallen off its hinges, leading directly to a downward-headed spiral staircase. It was the perfect place for the secluded conversation Starlight wanted. Based on the state of the room, Starlight had been using it as a base of operations for quite some time. While there were very faint hints of sunlight spilling through the gaps in the boarded-up windows, most of the light was a series of mismatched lamps scattered about the space as if by random. Tucked away in one corner was a small plastic trash bin that looked far too new to belong to the old military base, stuffed to the point of overflowing with discarded food wrappers. Next to the literal pile of trash sat an old oak desk that looked like it could have been here before Starlight came along. Time had not been kind to the piece of furniture, yet it was still standing, even though it looked like it could turn to dust if someone sneezed at it. The unicorn who had been squatting here had made use of it, though, given by the stacks of papers scattered across it. The only thing missing was a makeshift place to sleep, though it was very likely that there were other rooms in this tower Starlight had appropriated for her uses. Such places could wait, though. Twilight was here for answers, not a tour.
All right, we're alone.
Twilight turned to Starlight, a cold glare strewn about her face.
Let's hear what you have to... It wasn't supposed to be like this.
Starlight's interruption was carried on a heavy sigh. She slouched over as if deflated.
All it was meant to be was a push in the right direction. A little vague note to pique your curiosity and get you to... figure all this out on your own. I wasn't supposed to get so involved. That's an interesting way to start,
Twilight replied hesitantly, eyes narrowing as her frustration began to give way to intrigue.
So, would you care to explain why you chose to push me in the right direction? Because to me, it seems a little too convenient for you to pick the only alicorn in town.
There was a twinge of bitter sarcasm in her words, just enough to get the point across that she was still weary of Starlight's knowledge. A sharp inhale cut through Starlight's teeth, cueing the look of regret on her face. She pulled herself out of her stupor with a quick shake of her head, and magically reached into Twilight's saddlebags, drawing out the book and glasses that had been retrieved from Rainbow Dash just moments earlier. A wide, obviously forced grin took hold of her face as she brought the objects towards the dusty old desk.
How about we worry less about me and more about the oncoming end of the world? Seems like a much better use of our time, wouldn't you agree? You said we have 12 hours. Plenty of time for you to tell me. 11 hours and 18 minutes to be specific, but who's counting?
An unhinged chuckle echoed through the chamber as Starlight hurriedly tore through the first several pages. There was an almost psychotic smile on her face. She quickly snapped back to Twilight and gave her back the glasses.
There we go. You just need to read a few paragraphs and we'll all be set to keep going.
The elated look on Starlight's face slowly faded away as Twilight glared at her. She wasn't happy with the sudden attempt at a change in subject, and she made no effort to hide it. Starlight withered under that glare, her ears drooping.
How about you actually tell me what's going on here?
Twilight demanded, taking the glasses off with her own magic and placing them next to the book. She could deal with those later.
You obviously need me for whatever it is you have planned. You clearly know things about Spike and I that you shouldn't. If you want me to cooperate, you're going to give me an explanation. Period.
Silence fell over the room, and Starlight stood there, watching Twilight as if waiting for something to happen. She bit down on her lower lip, and her knees began to shake. Twilight could only guess what kind of thoughts were running through her head. She looked intimidated by Twilight, something that she honestly couldn't be blamed for. It was clear that she didn't want to tell Twilight what was going on, but it seemed Twilight's request had at least made her think twice about that plan. Finally, Starlight hung her head and sighed in defeat. She slowly trudged over to one corner of the room and placed her heavy saddlebags onto the floor before turning back to face Twilight.
Can you at least start reading first?
She pointed over to the book on the desk.
You deserve answers, and I want to give them to you, but you need to compromise with me here. The world as we know it is going to end if we waste all of our time bickering.
Twilight growled under her breath. She didn't like being jerked around like this, being left in the dark despite being supposedly an important player in this little game. But it was clear that Starlight was just as stubborn as Twilight was, if not more, and the continuous demand for answers was at this point only going to be met with more resistance. Another groan signaled her relenting to Starlight's increasingly restrictive demands. Giving the unicorn one last dirty look, Twilight turned her gaze to the book and glasses that had been left on the desk. A flourish of magic delivered the spectacles to her face, and she leaned in to read. As advertised by Rainbow Dash, the old Ciaran words were made to appear as if they had been written in modern equestrian. She found herself quickly taking them off and on to test the translation effect that they had on the pages, her sour mood giving way to giddy curiosity as she watched the words change. Even in this dire situation, she couldn't help but wonder just how they worked. It was remarkable, revolutionary even. A mental note was made for later to check and see if Dash would let her keep these things when all of this was said and done, or at least let her look them over so she could make her own pair later on. But her desire to learn how these glasses worked needed to be redirected toward the book placed in front of her, and the spell she supposedly needed to read. Just as she had confirmed the last time she read this book, it was written more like someone's research log or journal on the choir. The page Twilight had been told to start on spoke heavily of the choir's supposed true nature. It wasn't the godlike entity that Nox and his allies worshipped. It was more like an arcane parasite of presumably extraplanar origin that had been present in this world for centuries untold, even at the time of this book's writing. Despite the entity's boast to Twilight that it was a being far above this world, the author of the book had seemingly managed to discover and prove that the choir was reliant on a connection to a mortal being in order to survive.
It manipulates the heart and mind of its host, drawing out and feeding off the darkest parts of their psyche in order to survive.
Twilight donned a concerned grimace as she silently read the words.
In turn, the host is influenced to act in ways that benefit the choir's motives, being granted physical mutations and arcane abilities in order to accomplish these goals.
What these goals entailed wasn't made clear, at least here, but there was something almost as useful left to be seen. While there was evidently no way to track where the choir had come from, the book's author had managed to find its earliest actions within the material world. The distant nation of Minok seemed to be where the choir first made itself known. And what Twilight was reading, if it was true, then the Minotaur nation owned its entire existence to the entity. It was utterly impossible for Twilight not to recognize the name of the great overboss Steve with many sharp horns for stabbing with. a rather prominent figure in the overall history of the world, as he was credited with the unification of the numerous Minotaur tribes under one banner, using both masterful diplomacy and incredible violence. The journal made it a point to mention Steve's unique trait of having several horns, where the normal Minotaur would only have 2, as well as an apparent fondness that he had for garbing himself in wolf pelts. At some point, however, Steve lost his life in a campaign to conquer the Kingdom of Grifel, something else that this journal saw fit to detail. But it wasn't long after his demise that the choir's second known host made himself known in the Griffinlands, and it was yet another name that Twilight recognized from history. Basil of the House of Grimtal, otherwise known by aliases such as Basil the Terrible, Basil the Impaler, and Bladebeak Basil. That last nickname had been given for good reason. All depictions of the infamous dictator showed him to have a serrated beak, like a weapon instead of a piece of his biology. In his time, he was a warlord who led an insurrection attempt to overthrow his homeland's centralized government. An insurrection who had flown flags depicting a wolf pack. Something else that seemed to tie him to the choir's chosen canine form, according to the book. Twilight stopped reading, her mind wandering back to her short time in the world of dreams. The field of black, thorny vines was just as vivid to her now as when she was stranded in that nightmare. But more specifically, Twilight found her thoughts lingering on the deformed and discarded remains of once living things tangled within the bramble. The skull of a minotaur with far too many horns, and that of a griffin with a saw-like beak were among the remnants of life she had seen. It had been unsettling back then, but now it was enough to make Twilight tremble with the new and horrific context. Those hadn't been ominous decorations meant to intimidate. They were trophies. Prizes claimed from previous vessels of the choir, a literal head count of the lives that this thing had dominated.
The choir's been around for a very long time.
Starlight suddenly spoke up, having noticed a shift in Twilight's posture. Her sudden voice was enough to make the alicorn flinch before turning back to face her. She wore an equally uncomfortable expression.
But it isn't as eternal as it would make you think, as I'm sure you managed to read. I saw mention of something like that, yeah.
Twilight glanced back to the book for a split second before turning back to Starlight. It was true that the entries she had read told that the choir needed a host to survive, but it hadn't really provided much evidence to back up those claims. As such, Twilight couldn't help but doubt.
It didn't give any proof, though. Why else would it cling to lesser beings like a tick?
Starlight strode past Twilight, flipping through the book's pages again.
It's not the god that it wants us to think it is. It's a parasite. And like any parasite, it will die if it doesn't have something to feed off of.
Twilight narrowed her eyes into a skeptical glare, thinking back to the conversation she had had with Rainbow the other night.
I was told that the choir couldn't be stopped, only stalled, right? Yeah, because the choir's disciples would go around letting info slip that their god can actually die.
Starlight interrupted with another sarcastic quip.
They've been at this for almost as long as the choir's been around, and they've been feeding people like the Black Hoofs fake intel for literal centuries to keep them off the right trail. And you expect me to just believe that?
Twilight shrugged, unsure of what she was supposed to believe. The way that Starlight spoke so casually about this lent some credit to what she was saying, but at the same time, she had been closed off and dishonest until very recently, and it was easy to believe that Starlight was trying to deceive Twilight again.
You can believe me or not, the truth is still the truth, and nothing's going to change it.
Starlight stopped turning through the book's pages and locked eyes with Twilight. There was a fire in her gaze, an intensity that told Twilight that Starlight was not going to tolerate any nonsense.
I brought you here to help you get ready for what's coming next, and the only thing I can do is arm you with the knowledge I have. If you don't want to believe me, you could at least not rub it in my face. This is hard enough for me already.
Starlight returned to skimming the book for the next passage she needed Twilight to read through with a huff. And Twilight was left momentarily speechless at the answer she had been given. Or, to be more specific, the way the answer had been given. Starlight's tone had been exasperated, yet tired. But more than that, it was clear to see that she was upset. She had said so herself, and her tone and body language reflected it. Although Starlight's mental and emotional well-being weren't high on Twilight's list of priorities, such formalities hadn't even crossed her mind. Starlight held information that Twilight supposedly needed to stop the end of the world, as well as a still unexplained knowledge of her and Spike. And it was now that Twilight decided it was time to press for some answers again.
In that case, since you're here to give me information...
Twilight spoke cordially enough, despite the situation.
How about you make good on your end of the bargain and actually tell me who you are and why you know about me?
Starlight slowly looked up from the book to stare into the decrepit wall ahead of her.
Really? You're still on about that now? You said I needed to compromise, and I did. It's time for you to meet me halfway. You wouldn't believe me even if I told you. And you're going to let that stop you now?
Twilight vindictively smirked.
After everything I just read... Here, if I choose not to believe you, I won't rub it in your face.
Silence. Starlight stared at the wall intensely. It almost looked as if she was trying to knock it over with just her gaze. She was still as a statue, her expression grim. It was clear she was having a hard time coming up with a rebuttal. There was the slightest tremble that traveled from one end of her body to the other, before a sudden sigh marked the end of her silence. She turned and stormed over to the other side of the room, practically burying her face in the corner. Starlight continued.
That's not what I'm worried about.
Her voice was shaking, and Twilight knew the cadence of a mare on the verge of breaking down. She had been in a similar state the previous day. But despite this, she didn't relent, at least not entirely. While she felt an onset of empathy for this mare's supposed trouble with the topic, that didn't change the fact that Twilight felt violated by Starlight's intimate knowledge of her and her son, not to mention the inexplicable need for Twilight to be wrapped up in this literal world-ending scenario. She deserved answers, and she was sick and tired of waiting for them.
Well, I'm sorry, but I really don't care what you're worried about. You are the one who's been trying to make me solve this cryptic puzzle by myself. You're the one who invaded my home and put a dangerous charm on my son. You're the one who knows things that you have no business knowing.
Twilight snarled, emphasizing her words by aggressively pointing her hoof at Starlight. She wasn't yelling yet, but she was sure ready to.
And to top it all off, you're the one who won't even give me an explanation. And you seem to think that I'm just going to be okay with that? Well, guess what? I'm not. If you want me to play along with your little plan, you could at least tell me... Do you think I wanted this to happen?
Starlight yelled as she spun around. The anxiety and trepidation she had been displaying were gone, replaced by a painful rage.
Do you think I'm getting some kind of sick kick out of this? I don't want to be here. I shouldn't be here, but I am. I'm here because I've made mistakes. Huge mistakes that took away everything and everyone I ever cared about, and put the whole of creation at risk. And the only thing I have left is the insignificantly small chance that I can set things right.
Her flash of anger was quick to burn away. Starlight's rant faded into a defeated monologue, accompanied by tears that began to flow down her cheeks. Twilight was ready to consider this just another lie, but something about this just made her doubt that. This kind of anguish was incredibly difficult to fake. Twilight went to say something, but Starlight continued, cutting her off.
If I could do this without getting you involved, I would. If I could get somebody else to do it, I would. But it has to be you, Twilight. And it hurts me to be the one to put you through all of this.
Starlight hung her head. A moment later, she pulled it back up and trudged to her saddlebags. She opened them up and began to push things around.
I don't like having to lie to you like I have been, Twilight. But I was scared that if I tried to tell you the truth, I might scare you off this time around. And I couldn't let that happen. So I tried to push you in the right direction from the sidelines. But I pushed you too hard, and now we're here.
Twilight blinked in confusion. It had to be her? What in the world did that mean? But more than that...
What do you mean, this time around? I mean, I've done this all before. I've tried to stop the choir myself, but I couldn't, because I'm not you. I tried to get others to do it when you didn't show up, but they couldn't, because they weren't you!
Starlight declared to Twilight, her tears returning as she bore her heart out. And now Twilight knew that there was no faking this desperation.
I don't know why it has to be you, but it has to be you. That's how things are supposed to be.
Gritting her teeth, Starlight made a sound that was somewhere between a groan and a scream, kicking over her bags in a fit of rage before spinning back and scattering a few items across the floor. It was as if she couldn't even stand to look at Twilight. A chill settled over the room as everything went quiet. Anything Twilight could think of saying ended up getting caught in her throat. Starlight's outburst raised more questions than it answered, as most of what she had said just didn't make any sense. Starlight had previously mentioned that she'd been doing this for a long time, and how things weren't supposed to be the way that they were now. Yet more evidence to support the fact that Starlight knew more than she should. And whatever it was tearing her apart emotionally. Twilight found herself ruminating on this for some time, actually feeling sorry for the mayor. Why she felt this way, she couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was just her bleeding heart getting the better of her. Or maybe she was just legitimately concerned for this person's well-being, stranger or not. Whatever the reason, she couldn't bring herself to ignore Starlight's plight. Even if her methods weren't the greatest or most thought out, it was becoming clear at this point that her intentions weren't sinister. She was just a mayor who knew too much, trying to do the right thing. Something Twilight could relate to only all too well.
That's how things were before I mucked everything up.
Starlight kept going, no longer yelling, just speaking in the voice of a beaten down and broken mare.
I wish I could change that. But it's the one thing I can't. And you're not going to accept that as an answer.
Starlight took a deep breath, regaining her composure. Her attention shifted to the scattered objects across the floor.
I know I'm going to regret this, but I don't know what else I can do at this point.
With bated breath, Twilight watched as Starlight lifted and offered yet another dusty old book to her. It was large and very old, stuffed to the brim with makeshift bookmarks and other loose strands of paper. The cover was worn down. The simple and bland diamond-esque pattern that decorated it faded with time. But as Twilight looked at it, it actually felt somehow familiar to her. Before she could muse on that, though, Starlight opened up the book and flipped through the pages with pinpoint focus.
What is this?
Twilight moved to try and catch some glimpse at whatever secrets this book held. But Starlight was keen on keeping Twilight's nose out of this business until she was ready.
You wanted to know why I know so much, right?
Starlight mumbled with a slight twinge of bitterness.
Well, the short version is that I've been keeping up on my reading.
With that, the book was magically thrust back towards Twilight, held firmly in place by Starlight's magic. Without even being given a chance to question things, Starlight gave a firm order.
Read.
Twilight gave a cautious grimace before turning her attention to the book. While it was true that she wanted answers, Starlight's breakdown just now made her actually hesitant on getting them. An unpleasant feeling of foreboding welled up inside of her, and she got the impression that whatever was written here was not something that she was meant to see. She shook the feeling off, though. She wouldn't back out now, not after Starlight had finally caved in. But as she began to read, the ominous feeling got worse. The first few words alone were enough to get her undivided attention. The book's well-worn cover had been vaguely familiar, but the contents within were disturbingly so. It was clearly a journal, but from the entry's date and how it had all been written, there was no doubting who had written it.
Journal entry number 343, May 16th, year 1011 on the Grand Celestial Calendar.
This was Twilight's journal.